Who lied in the Garden of Eden? Was it the serpent or was it God? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and traditionally we think of the serpent as having deceived Eve. After all, that's what Eve says in Genesis 3:13. The serpent deceived me. But when we allow the texts of Genesis 2 and 3 to operate on their own terms, the waters become a little murkier, because we have two different sets of claims to look at. In Genesis 2:17, God tells Adam, on the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will certainly die. We also have in Genesis 3, verses 4 and 5, the serpent telling Eve, you will not die, and you will become like the gods, knowing good and evil. So we have three different claims. Of those three different claims, only the serpent's claims appear to be true. After all, in Genesis 3:22, God observes that the humans have become like one of us, one of the gods, precisely as the serpent said in verse 5. So that part of the serpent's claims is demonstrably true, at least according to the text of Genesis 3. So the other two claims are a little muddier. The serpent says, you will not surely die. So the question is, in what sense does the serpent mean you will not surely die? When we look at Genesis 2:17, and we look at the fact that the paronomastic infinitive that is used to mean you will certainly die, it is mot tamut. This is used dozens of times in Hebrew, the paronomastic infinitive with the verbal root mot. Sometimes in the active, sometimes in the passive. In every single instance, it refers to literal biological death. So there are a lot of people who say, no, you just don't understand the Bible, Dan. This is referring to spiritual death. There are no data that support that. If the words of the Hebrew are to have anything to do with how we interpret the words of the Hebrew, then this refers to literal biological death. And then we have the question of when that's supposed to happen according to Genesis 2:17. And on the day has been interpreted since the middle of the 2nd century BCE in the book of Jubilees as a reference to this poetic notion that a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years. And so Adam didn't live to be 1,000 years old, so obviously he died on the day. But that's not how the phrase on the day is used in Hebrew. We have to look at the rhetorical scope and the specific events that are being discussed. When the event that precipitates the thing that's going to happen on the day are very chronologically precise and short-lived events, then the on the day usually means within roughly 24 hours. So for instance, in Genesis, when Abraham's son is weaned, they throw a feast on the very day. So that does not mean within 1,000 years. That does not mean more or less sometime after. It means on the day. And this is what we have in Genesis 2, because the threat is that Adam would literally and biologically die, which is something that happens in a very chronologically precise schedule. And it arrives as a result of Adam eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is another chronologically precise act. So there are no grounds to argue that on the day means anything other than roughly within the 24-hour period. So Genesis 2:17 is a clear threat that Adam would be literally and biologically executed if he ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That didn't happen. Now, when the serpent tells Eve, you will not surely die, since the threat is that they would literally and biologically die within 24 hours, the serpent's statement there is also true, because Adam and Eve did not literally die on that very day. So when we look at the three statements in Genesis 2:17 and then in Genesis 3, 4, and 5, only the serpent's claims are true. God's assertion is not true. Now, does that necessarily mean it's a lie in Genesis 2:17? Well, that depends on other things. Do you presuppose that the God who threatened Adam is omniscient? Then that God would know that Adam was going to eat of the fruit and would know that they were not going to execute Adam. And so I think that kind of constitutes a lie. It's, at the very least, misleading. Now, there is another way to interpret this, that God changed their mind as a result of Adam eating the fruit and decided, you know what, I'm just not going to impose such a severe punishment. If you want to interpret it that way, that's fine. I think that means backing away from the assertion of the omniscience of God, but it doesn't necessarily mean God is lying. However, going back to Eve, the serpent did not lie to Eve, unless you understand the serpent's two true claims to be misleading insofar as he omitted the fact that there would be consequences for Eve eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And those consequences are laid out later in Genesis 3. Now, Eve does say in Genesis 3:13, the serpent deceived me. But this is also an attempt to pass the buck. Just like Adam was like, she told me to. Eve is saying, oh, the serpent tricked me or deceived me. Does that necessarily mean the serpent lied? Not really. It just means that Eve was trying to pass the buck to the serpent, and God seemed to be taking seriously everyone's attempt to pass the buck. Now, there's one other thing to consider. Were Adam and Eve already immortal before eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? There are no data that support that notion. They were probably created mortal already, because you create all kinds of problems when you presume that they are already immortal. For instance, what does God say after they eat? Well, better not let them eat from the tree of life, otherwise they'll live forever. Well, if they're already living forever, then why would they need to stop them from living forever? But if they have already been eating from the tree of life, which is an assumption that you can assert in order to protect the dogmatic interpretation of Adam and Eve as already immortal, then does one bite from the tree of life render you immortal, or does eating from the tree temporarily render you immortal? That's not how immortality works. That's not immortality. So you create more problems for yourself than you solve by imagining that Adam and Eve were already immortal. Also, God is represented as a jealous God trying to protect the features of divinity, including immortality, and so it is almost certain that God would not have created the humans immortal in light of their jealousy of that divine attribute that they want to deny the humans. And the other attribute of immortality in the ancient world was full access to strategic knowledge, which could be what the merism of knowledge of good and evil is a reference to. So that would be the other prototypical feature of deity that God is trying to keep away from Adam and Eve from the very beginning. And so the notion that the serpent was lying because Eve would become mortal after eating the fruit is not supported by the data. So the waters are a little muddier, but when it comes to the serpent's two assertions and God's one assertion, the serpent's claims were more true than God's claims. So, when it comes to who lied in the Garden of Eden, the serpent or God, the preponderance of evidence points to God being the one who is more deceptive or more untruthful than the serpent, whose two claims turned out to be true. And at best, the serpent was being misleading by not letting Eve know there would be other consequences for eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the fit for this video has been Dolly Parton.